Hello, and this is Miss Yetter, and we are reading Hollow City, the second novel of Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. This is Chapter 2, Part 2. Let's open our books to page 43 and continue. Walking down the water's edge, I tried to picture myself the way my new friends saw me, or wanted to. Not as Jacob, the kid who once broke his ankle running after an ice cream truck, or who, reluctantly and at the behest of his dad, tried and failed 3 times to get onto his school's non-competitive track team, but as Jacob, inspector of shadows, miraculous interpreter of squirming gut feelings, seer and slayer of real and actual monsters, and all that might stand between life and death for our merry band of peculiars. How could I ever live up to my grandfather's legacy? I climbed a stack of rocks at the water's edge and stood there, hoping the steady breeze would dry my damp clothes. And in the dying light, I watched the sea, a canvas of shifting grays, melding and darkening. In the distance, a light glinted ever so often. It was Cairnholm's lighthouse, flashing its hello and last goodbye. My mind drifted. I lapsed into a walking dream. I see a man. He is a middle-aged, cloaked in excremental mud, crabbing slowly along the knife tip of a cliff, his thin hair uncombed and hanging wet across his face. Wind whips his thin jacket like a sail. He stops, drops to his elbows, slips them into debits he'd made weeks before, when he was scouting these coves for mating terns and shearwater's nest. He raises a pair of binoculars to his eyes, but aims them low, below the nest, at a thin crescent of beach where the swelling tide collects things and heaves them up. Driftwood and seawood, shards of smashed boats, and sometimes, the locals say, bodies. The man is my father. He is looking for something that he desperately does not want to find. He is looking for the body of his son. I felt a touch on my toe and opened my eyes. Startled out of my half dream, I was nearly dark, and I was sitting on the rocks with my knees drawn into my chest, and suddenly there was Emma. Breeze tossed her hair, standing on the sand below me. "How are you?" she asked. It was a question that would have required some college-level math and about an hour of discussion to answer. I felt 100 conflicting things, the great bulk of which canceled out to equal cold and tired and not particularly interested in talking. So I said, "I'm fine, just trying to dry off," and flapped the front of my soggy sweater to demonstrate. "I can help you with that." She clambered up the stack of rocks and sat next to me. "Give me an arm." I offered one up, and Emma laid it across her knees. Cupping her hands over her mouth, she bent her head toward my wrist. Then, taking a deep breath, she exhaled slowly through her palms, and an incredible, soothing heat bloomed along my forearm, just on the edge of painful. "It is too much." "Is it too much?" she said. I tensed, a shudder going through me, and shook my head. "Good." She moved farther up my arm to exhale again. Another pulse of sweet warmth. Between breaths, she said, "I hope you're not letting what Enoch said bother you. The rest of us believe in you, Jacob. Enoch can be a wrinkle-hearted old tittermouse, especially when he's feeling jealous. I think he's right, I said. You don't really, do you? It all came pouring out. I have no idea what I'm doing, I said. How can any of you depend on me? If I'm really peculiar, then it's just a little bit, I think. Like I'm a quarter peculiar and the rest of you guys are full-blooded. It doesn't work like that, she laughed. But my grandfather was more peculiar than me. He had to be. He was so strong. No, Jacob, she said, narrowing her eyes at me. It's astounding in so many ways. You're just like him. You're different too, of course. You're gentler and sweeter, but everything you're saying, you should like, you sound like Abe when he first came to stay with us. I do? Yes, he was confused too. He'd never met another peculiar. He didn't understand his power or how it worked or what he was capable of. Neither did we, to tell you the truth. It's very rare what you can do, very rare. But your grandfather learned. How? I asked. Where? In the war. He was part of a secret, all peculiar cell of the British Army. Fought hollow gassed and Germans at the same time. The sorts of things they did you don't win medals for, but they were heroes to us, and none more than your grandfather. The sacrifices they made set the corrupted back decades and saved the lives of countless peculiars. And yet, I thought, he couldn't save his own parents. How strangely tragic. And I can tell you this, Emma went on, you're every bit as peculiar as he was, and as brave too. Now you're just trying to make me feel better. No, she said, look at me in the eye. I'm not. You'll learn, Jacob. One day you'll be an even greater hollow slayer than he was. Yeah, that's what everyone keeps saying. How can you be so sure? It's something I feel very, very deeply, she said. You're supposed to, I think, just like you were supposed to come to Cairnholm. I don't believe in stuff like that. Fate, the stars, destiny. I didn't say destiny. Supposed to is the same thing. I said, destiny is for people in books about magical swords. It's a lot of crap. I'm here because my grandfather mumbled something about your island in the 10 seconds before he died, and that's it. It was an accident. I'm glad he did, but he was delirious. He could just as easily have rattled off a grocery list. But he didn't, she said. I sighed, exasperated. And if we go off in search of loops and you depend on me to save you from monsters and instead I get you all killed, is that destiny too? She frowned, put my arm back in my lap. I didn't say destiny, she said again. What I believe is that when it comes to big things in life, there are two accidents. Everything happens for a reason. You're here for a reason, and it's not to fail and die. I didn't have the heart to keep arguing. Okay, I said. I don't think you're right, but I do hope you are. I felt bad for snapping at her before, but I'd been cold and scared and feeling defensive. I had good moments and bad, terrified thoughts and confident ones, though my terror to confidence ratio was pretty dismal at present, like 3-1. And in the terrified moments, it felt like I was being pushed into a role I hadn't asked for, volunteered for frontline duty in a war, the full scope of which none of us yet knew. Destiny sounded like an obligation, and if I was to be thrust into battle against a legion of nightmare creatures, that had to be my choice, though, in a sense, the choice had been made already when I agreed to sail into the unknown with those peculiar children. And it wasn't true. If I really searched the dusty corners of myself, that I hadn't asked for this. Really, I'd been dreaming of such an adventure since I was small. Back then, I believed in destiny and believed in it absolutely and with every strand and fiber of my little kid heart. I'd felt it like an itch in my chest while listening to my grandfather's extraordinary stories. One day, that will be me. What felt like obligation now had been a promise back then, that one day I would escape my little town and live an extraordinary life as he had done, and that one day, like Grandpa Portman, I would do something that mattered. He used to say to me, "You're going to be a great man, Jacob, a very great man." "Like you?" I would ask him. "Better," he'd reply. I'd believed him then, and I still wanted to, but the more I learned about him, the longer his shadow became, and the more impossible it seemed that I could ever matter the way he had, that maybe it would be suicidal even to try. And when I imagined myself trying, thoughts of my grandfather crept in, my poor, about to be devastated father, and before I could push them out of my mind, I wondered how a great man could do something so terrible to someone who loved him. I began to shiver. "You're cold," Emma said. "Let me finish what I started." She picked up my other arm and kissed with her breath the whole length of it. It was almost more than I could handle. When she reached my shoulder, instead of placing the arm in my lap, she hung it around her neck. I lifted my other arm in I lifted my other arm to join it, and she put her arms around me too, and our foreheads knotted together. Speaking very quietly, Emma said, "I hope you don't regret the choice you made. I'm so glad you're here with us. I don't know what I'd do if you left. I fear I wouldn't be all right at all." I thought about going back. For a moment, I really tried to play it out in my head, how it would be if I could somehow row one of our boats back to the island again and go back home. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't imagine. I whispered, "How could I?" "When Miss Peregrine turns human again, she'll be able to send you back if you want to go." My question hadn't been about logistics. I had meant simply, "How could I leave you?" But those words were unsayable, couldn't find their way past my lips. So I held them inside, and instead I kissed her. This time it was Emma whose breath cut short. Her hands rose in my cheeks, but stopped just shy of making contact. Heat radiated from them in waves. "Touch me," I said. "I don't want to burn you," she said, but a sudden shower of sparks inside my chest, and I don't care. So I took her fingers and raked them along my cheek, and both of us gasped. It was hot, but I didn't pull away, daring not, for fear she'd stop touching me. And then our lips met again, and we were kissing again, and her extraordinary warmth surged through me. My eyes fell closed, the world faded away. If my body was cold in the night mist, I didn't feel it. If the sea roared in my ears, I didn't hear it. If the rock I sat on was sharp and jagged, I hardly noticed. Everything outside the two of us was a distraction. And then a great crash echoed in the dark. But I thought nothing of it, could not take myself away from Emma, until the sound doubled and was joined by an awful shriek of metal, and a blinding light swept over us, and finally I couldn't shut it out any more. "The lighthouse," I thought. "The lighthouse is falling into the sea." But the lighthouse was a pinpoint in the distance, not a sun-bright flash, and its light only traveled in one direction, not back and forth searching. It wasn't a lighthouse at all. It was a searchlight, and it was coming from the water close to shore. It was the searchlight of a submarine. Brief second of terror in which brain and legs were disconnected. My eyes and ears registered the submarine not far from shore. Metal beast rising from the sea, water rushing from its sides, men bursting onto its deck from open hatches, shouting, training cannons of light at us. And then the stimulus reached my legs, and we slid, fell, and pitched ourselves down from the rocks and ran like hell. The spotlight threw our positioning shadows across the beach, 10 feet tall and freakish. Bullets pocked the sand and buzzed the air. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. "Stop! Do not run!" We burst into the cave. "They're coming! They're here! Get up! Get up!" But the children heard the commotion and were already on their feet, all but Bronwyn, who was so exhausted himself at the sea that he had fallen asleep against the cave wall and couldn't be aroused. We shook her and shouted in her face, but she only moaned and brushed us away with a sweep of her arm. Finally, we had to hoist her up by the waist, which was like lifting a tower of bricks. But once her feet touched the ground, her red-rimmed eyelids split open, and she took her own way. We grabbed up our things, thankful now that they were so small and so few. Emma scooped Miss Peregrine into her arms. We tore outside as we ran into the dunes. I saw behind us a gang of silhouetted men splashing the last few feet to shore. In their hands, held above their heads to keep them dry, were guns. We sprinted through a stand of wind-blown trees and into the trackless forest. Darkness enveloped us. What moon wasn't already hidden behind clouds, was blotted out now by trees, branches filtering its pale light to nil. There was no time for our eyes to adjust, or to feel our way carefully, or to do anything other than run in a gasping, stumbling herd with arms outstretched, dodging trunks that seemed to coalesce suddenly in the air just inches from us. After a few minutes, we stopped, just heaving to listen. The voices were still behind us, only now they were joined by another sound, dogs barking. We ran on. And that concludes part 2 of chapter 2 of Hollow City.